Hi everyone, welcome to our May edition of Sitrion Talks. I'm Luke Sinclair, our Director of Community Management here at Sitrion, and I'm really excited to be joined by today's special guests, Jamie Nodder and Maddie Grant, who are consultants and authors and I'd say long-time friends of Sitrion, and we are going to talk all about their new book, When Millennials Take Over, Preparing for the Ridiculously Optimistic Future of Business. It's kind of almost a tongue twister. Hi guys.
Hello.
It's good to have you back with us on Sitrion Talks. I thought before we kick off we would just do a couple of little housekeeping announcements. First of all, if you are watching live, we have the Q&A enabled on the YouTube stream. So if you want to ask a question of Jamie or Maddie during the session, please pump it straight into the Q&A app and I will pose the question for you. But that being said, straight after this at 2 o'clock Eastern, we're going to be joining up with the Community Roundtable, who host their weekly Twitter jam called ESN Chat, Enterprise Social Network Chat. And Jamie and Maddie are going to be special guests there today. So if you do have any questions, they're going to be live on Twitter to answer them at 2 o'clock. So whichever way you want to play it, you want to save it for Twitter, or you can ask live on the Hangout. If you are tweeting during the call for the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes, we're using the hashtag #SitrionTalks. So let's get on with what we're here to talk about. Jamie and Maddie, the new book launched how long ago now?
A couple months.
Yeah.
How's it all going?
Great. We're getting good attention and good conversations out of it. We're pleased.
I was really lucky because I got the opportunity to peer review before it got published, and I think it goes without saying that I'm a big fan of lots of the ideas and the concepts that you portray in there. And if anyone hasn't seen it, let me just make sure it's in camera. That's what it looks like with a big winking smiley face.
If anyone doesn't like it, it's Luke's fault.
I thought we would kick off and start to kind of wind back for those who aren't so familiar with the book so far and just talk a little bit about the millennials. So in the book we talk about some of the factors that have influenced this generation's kind of behavior and their mindset. So I thought maybe let's start by kind of expanding a little bit on who the millennials are and what makes them kind of, who they are.
Sure. The millennial generation, I think a lot of people recognize that they were shaped a lot by the social internet, right? Like this is the generation that grew up with the internet. Only the oldest members of the generation have any memory actually of working without having the internet, and particularly the social internet where they can reach out to their networks and just sort of get things done. So we've noticed that when they enter the workforce, they're really big on just being able to do it themselves, right? Like they don't understand why they need to get jump through hoops to get things done because their whole lives, even when they were young, like kids, they've been able to get stuff done. So the social internet is big. This generation grew up with more abundance than previous generations. So again, related to the internet too, like they always had information available. They more often than not had resources available, and they show up in the workplace and we're told, well, the budget cycle ended, you can't really request that till 18 months from now, and this just doesn't make sense to them. It's one thing about the millennials that we did discover in our research is they're really scratching their heads when they look at our organizations today and sort of how we run things. It really doesn't make sense to them. So those are probably two biggest factors I see that shape them and their behavior in the workplace.
Cool. In the book, you guys talk about like the four kind of pillars that companies need to focus on or to assess when it comes to dealing with this sort of next generation of workers. What I love is that you kind of like break it down and make it like fairly simple for organizations to kind of approach it. So we talk about digital, clear, fluid, and fast. Most people who are watching have never read the book, so let's talk about how you came up with these. What was the kind of how did you approach this as a project?
Yeah, sure. So just to give a little bit of background, we actually wrote a book in 2011 called Humanize, which you know about because we've talked about this with you guys before. But it was really about how the social media was changing not just how we market and communicate with our customers, but actually how we lead and manage our organizations. But that was 3 years ago. And now in 2015, we realized that the things that we talked about in Humanize around how organizations needed to change related to being more authentic and decentralized and transparent and things like that. All of those things were still happening, but they were really being catalyzed by the millennials who are now entering into management positions. The oldest millennials are in their early 30s, and they've been in the workforce for a decade, so they're no longer, kids these days. So what we did was we looked at companies, on the one hand, that had really awesome cultures, companies where people were saying, we can't imagine working anywhere else, because we wanted to find the positive deviants, like the companies that are really, really successful and different. And then we compared that to research with over 200 millennials in the workplace that we asked about their thoughts around leadership and management and how the workplace was organized and things like that. And we looked for the place, we're consultants, so we like Venn diagrams, the place where the awesome cultures connected with millennials, opinions on how they work or how they want to work. So that's how we came up with the 4 key capacities, is what we call them, of the new kind of millennial workplace, which are digital, clear, fluid, and fast. But those 4 themes basically emerged from these conversations with millennials and these case studies of really amazing companies with amazing cultures.
In the book, I love when you talk about the perfect storm that's formed, and I guess that is part to do with some of this research and part to do with the millennials arriving. Can you tell us a little bit, tell the audience a little bit about like what the perfect storm is?
Yeah, this one was particularly interesting to me in doing the research, because there's been a lot of talk about millennials and sort of why they're important and why they need our attention. But what I haven't seen connecting is this sort of bigger picture changes that are going on. So, like, when we talk about the perfect storm, one aspect is the social internet, right, which I mentioned before. It's not just, as Maddie says, it's not just changing marketing communications, it's changing the way we work and the way we run organizations, but even more than that, it is changing society as a whole, right? I mean, this is fundamentally shifting power away from centralized institutions and towards the people, towards the periphery. Like, we can now do things as individuals that we couldn't dream of doing, 10 or 15 years ago. And that sort of changes everyone's sort of attitude to not just how we work inside organizations, but how we do things sort of societally. And in that process, there's been like really big change. Now, at the same time that change has been happening, which again we wrote about in Humanize, leadership and management has also seen some pretty radical changes in the last 15 years. And we talked about the history of management in Humanize and how it's about 100 years old and starting to crumble. And I think we've been complaining about command and control, management structures for decades. But really in the last 5 years or so, we're actually seeing viable alternatives. Right, like when Zappos, which is like 1,500 employees or so, when they can embrace holacracy, right, and literally erase their entire organizational chart and replace it with a series of circles that get drawn and redrawn by the employees themselves based on emerging tensions inside the organization, how that works. Like, we didn't have that 5 or 10 years ago, so we could complain about command and control. We couldn't really do much about it. And so we're seeing more and more organizations actually do things differently with management, which I think is going to speed up our ability to change things that we've been frustrated with for a long time. So social media is changing the world, management is changing and crumbling and being reinvented at the same time. Those two trends are met with the millennial generation. right, which is coming in not only shaped, like I said, about like with the social internet and with abundance and these different approaches to working, but also just remembering that there's 80 million of them. Right? There are more millennials than any other generation in this country. In a few years, they're going to be the largest segment of the workforce, and they're going to hold that spot for decades. Okay, and so when these three things coming together means that management is going to change, and this is something that I don't think I've been able to communicate clearly enough to people. It's going to change so much more quickly than we're ready for. We have never seen, this is my prediction, we have never seen an era when management is going to shift this quickly. Or maybe it was 100 years ago when management was invented that this kind of change happened. But in our lifetimes, we don't know what this looks like. And so that's why, I think that's why this topic has become even more important, actually, and that we start actually talking about millennials in a more productive way, because these changes are going to happen. They're going to happen really fast. And so your choice right now is stay ahead of that curve or spend the next 15 years scrambling to catch up. And the time to make that choice is now. If we don't start changing things internally now, I think we're going to be struggling to catch up for a while.
Yeah, I think you're right. I know after when I first reviewed the book, one of my comments was that it's so refreshing to have like millennials talked about in an optimistic way, because so many times you go to business meetings and you meet with different people and they say, oh, the millennials, like it's this kind of doom cloud attached to this arrival of this generation. So it's refreshing to have like the optimism, I think. I thought we should talk through, without giving everything away in the book, but talk through each of these four kind of pillars that you think that companies need to focus on. So let's talk first about digital. What does this mean? Obviously, this is something I think very close to Sitrion as a business. So I'm interested to hear what you think companies should be focusing on there.
Yeah, so digital is the first key capacity. It's probably fairly obvious as a theme. We know that millennials are very embedded in the social internet, for example. And we also know that keeping up to speed with the latest digital technology is important in general for business. But when we talk about digital, it goes beyond that. It goes to the digital mindset. And we define the digital mindset as being a relentless focus on the user of your organization. So that means the customer, but that also means the employee. And it means being able to customize and personalize their experience regardless of who they are. So every employee at every level and any customer, the middle of your market as well as the high rollers in your market, every one of those people needs to be able to have a customized and personalized experience in the same way that a software designer will create a program that works on iPhone and Android and BlackBerry maybe and every other, every browser, which is harder on the software maker, but they do that because that's the way to reach the people that they want to reach and to make their software work, right? So that's a big piece of it, the customization and personalization. But the other side of it too is continuous improvement and continuous learning. So your iPhone apps, they're always upgrading themselves. There's always a new version, and millennials have grown up with this. So they've they kind of expect that when they enter the workplace, is not only to use the right tools and use the right tools for the right job, but also to just continuously be evolving those tools as we evolve how we're working. You're muted, Luke.
Oh, whoops. I was getting right into it then.
I was going to try and read your lips, but I figured.
Absolutely love the idea of digital. We actually had a question come in, which I think probably is a good time to ask before we move on to the next one, and it's from Mike Brown, one of our customers, and Mike said, how do you think this change or the shift plays out for highly regulated, large organizations such as big financial institutions or pharmaceuticals. And I think, yeah, this is particularly relevant, especially to a lot of our customers, and certainly to Mike.
You want to take that, Maddie?
Yeah, you want me to take it?
I think you go first.
Okay. So yes, I think we're actually getting a lot of questions about large institutions. I think it impacts absolutely every kind of company, large and small, and every industry vertical. So that's something that's interesting, and you know, social media has done that to a greater or lesser extent also. So you know, every kind of company is ultimately people connecting with other people, even if it's you know, very deeply kind of a trade industry or something like that. So even though there are nuances, you know, the advent of social media has affected everybody. But for this in particular, every kind of company is dealing with the struggle with recruiting or retaining or engaging millennials either as employees or as customers. So the importance of trying to understand how they might be attracted to your organization, I think, is probably magnified when it comes to large organizations. And to be honest, we're a little bit worried, and I'll let Jamie speak more to this, but we're a little bit worried about larger organizations' ability to actually make the changes that we believe need to be made in order to really engage this future of your workforce. I mean, there were things that have been disrupted in the last few years that were institutions that we never thought could be disrupted, you know, and it happened almost overnight. So, so that's something that we're very aware of. The other thing I specifically wanted to mention, though, is that in the book, one of our case studies is a bank, and another of our case studies is a healthcare company, both of which operate in either highly regulated or highly hierarchical industries. So there are, you know, I think it's actually been really exciting to find some really good examples in unexpected places of where these ideas are working really well.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, we're really happy that our examples are kind of counterintuitive. When we talked about a digital company, someone that represents the digital mindset, we had a small nonprofit. So, like, we're pretty big on not giving you guys excuses. All right, I know you're a large company and you're regulated and it's really hard, and yeah, okay, fine. Well, all the other companies that had their excuses why they couldn't be digital, clear, fluid, or fast managed to do it. So, you know, let's go. Let's see what you got. That was sort of one of our reactions. But Maddie sort of made reference to being concerned about large organizations. I mean, I think large organizations, you will see in the book that all of our case studies are small companies. Okay, they're I think under 1,000 employees. So we don't have a case study from a really huge organization. There's a bunch of reasons for that. It's not that they don't exist necessarily, but they were harder to get as case studies. But large companies have scale. Okay, I got it. You guys have scale. You can accomplish a lot, and you can get a lot of profits out of that. What you don't have is the agility that these organizations have, like the ones that we're finding. And you're never going to be as agile and as flexible or fluid as, say, a company with 300 people in it. I get it. But you could certainly be a lot more fluid than you are now. I mean, I just don't sort of buy the excuse that there's no room. We heard Eric Ries speak at South by Southwest when we launched the book about, you know, he wrote the Lean Startup. And I love that he applies, you know, lean manufacturing methodology, like from Toyota, to software startup companies with maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 people in it. It's really cool to apply those ideas. What was more interesting to me is that he found that after the book came out, people like GE were interested in this. Okay, so GE is not a fluid, flexible, nimble, like they're a huge company, right? But they're applying lean startup methodology to one of their diesel engine projects, and it's working. And that's where you give people like the authority to do minimum viable product and put it out there and see if it works and test it with the market and then change it. Like, this is real agile stuff, and they're a huge company and they're doing it. So like, I don't know all the details of that. That's sort of Eric's thing, but I feel like The answer for large organizations, even in regulated industries, is how can I carve how can I make some boundaries? And within those boundaries, we're going to be agile. Within those boundaries, we're going to be digital, clear, fluid, and fast. Maybe it's a project, maybe it's a project team, maybe it's a region, maybe it's one office. I don't know what it is for you guys, but find places to experiment with this. I think managers' job is to be the protectors, right? Like guard those boundaries and don't let anyone in and let them do their work that way. Some of the organizations that we studied as case studies started as just that, experiments inside larger organizations that worked so well that they spun off and created their own organization. So even if that doesn't happen, I think if you start experimenting internally and it works really well, you can then sort of parlay that into some broader culture change.
I think me personally, having been someone who has always worked in large organizations, and certainly my career before Sitrion was in a large, heavily regulated financial services company down in Sydney, Australia. And, some of the things that you talk about in the books, even though some things might seem a stretch, some of the concepts we were certainly already trying to focus on. For example, in the clear section, you talk about sharing by default. And this is something that a lot of our customers at Sitrion really have as a cultural aspiration. Like, we want to have this culture where we come to work every day and we share things in our social intranet because that's just what we do. Tell us about the clear section. What does clear mean in more detail?
So clear is about making things visible. Internally and externally, although we tend to focus a little bit more on the internal. Making things visible, but not just for transparency's sake, but making them visible in order to increase the quality and quantity of good decisions that get made in the system. Okay, so it's ultimately about improving results because you're improving decision making by making things visible. And again, in traditional management, that was never, it just wasn't valued. Right, information was power, knowledge is power. Like, you don't share anything because someone might screw it up, someone might misinterpret it, right? So it's always about holding and controlling and only releasing to people when they need to know. But what we're discovering in this day and age is you can't predict ahead of time who needs to know. And if you try, you end up sort of the effort that you spend in trying to control the information so just the right people have it, you end up losing huge opportunities because people didn't have information that they could have used to take action. I love that in our case study organization, it's a software company, and they actually put all of their project management data up on the wall in the office. Okay, so there are only 50 people, but they all work in one room, and everybody's tasks are literally on paper on the wall, labeled sort of by day or in a week's worth of work. And as they get stuff done, they put colored dots on this paper. It's a software company, right? They use paper and dots, which we thought was cool. And so every single employee can see where every other employee is on all of their work. And so they actually make their own decisions about when to stop their own work and go help somebody because they can see all that information. And they do all this without managers and without boring project status update meetings and without those distracting emails saying, I'm behind, come help me, it's the last minute, right? So better decisions get made by making things more visible. They even will bring in, this one scares most people, they'll even bring in their customers and share unfinished work with them. Say, here, we haven't even finished this, doesn't even work, but here's what we've done so far, and we'll show you what it looks like. And then they use that. Then the customers can say, oh, well, that's interesting because you didn't know, but in the last week this happened, and therefore we really don't want this feature to be developed as much. We should really go in this direction. The more information that's shared, the more that's made visible to the system, the better the decisions get made. This company charges consistently more than their competitors, and I think probably takes longer to get it done, and they still have people lining up to use them because the quality is that good, right? The decisions are that good that they can get away with that. So that's sort of the power of making things visible.
Let's talk straight onto the third pillar, which is fluid. Tell us what does fluid mean, and how can organizations start thinking in a fluid way?
Yeah, so fluid is basically the next step. So all of these capacities kind of build on each other. And if you think about a millennial in a management position, entering or able to create systems where more information is visible to everybody, the next step up from that might be to get rid of the bureaucracy where information is traditionally siloed, right? So that's where the idea of flexible hierarchies comes in. And what's really interesting is we actually originally named this chapter Flat, but then as we were writing it and talking to people about it, we realized that it's not the verticalness of hierarchies that is bad. Like, you are always going to have more senior people and more junior people, or people who have been in the organization longer and people who have been in the organization less time. So that verticalness is natural, and there's no way, and it's not useful to get rid of it completely. But what is the problem is the rigidity of it. So what millennials are looking for are structures where they can come together for a project, come together for a task, and where they can bring in people who have expertise that is specific to that task. And that person with expertise could lead this team or project or department or whatever for X amount of time, which is also flexible, based on their expertise and their knowledge, as opposed to always having it be the more senior people who are in charge, basically. And I know everybody here, I'm sure, has heard of Zappos and holacracy. So holacracy is one model of doing this, and it's fairly complicated. You guys can look it up on Wikipedia to get the super specifics, but it's all about circles and tension, and there's all kinds of complicated things. But the point is that fairly big companies like Zappos are starting to actually very intentionally experiment with this. And what I love about Zappos is that they started the process of looking into this at least a year ago. And just this week, they actually decided to pay 3-month severance to any middle managers who did not want to be part of this holacracy system. And they had over 200 people actually take them up on this offer. So, which sounds kind of scary, right? Having like 10% of your workforce leave in one fell swoop. But to us, it's actually really amazing. It shows deep commitment to this kind of flexible hierarchy, and willingness to let people go who don't feel like that's the right place for them. So, and it's actually, to me, it's better on both sides. It's better on the side of Zappos because they can have everybody really committed to this system. And it's, of course, better for the people who are leaving who might not be happy in the system. So you're not trying to force everybody into working a certain way. You're being flexible, basically. So that's what flexible is about. Fluid is about.
Fluid, flat, and flexible.
Yeah. Just to get really confusing.
So the last one that you talk about, which I really like this as well, is fast. And I feel this ties back to the question that Mike asked before. A lot of companies talk about wanting to be more agile, have a quicker time to market, be more innovative, but it's really hard to put that into place. I remember in my previous career, and we worked with lots of big companies, and they'd be like, oh yeah, we're a slow ship to turn. I've heard this over and over again. How does a company become fast? Like, it's okay for these small ones or the Zapposes. What about the big giants? How do they start to be more nimble?
So, well, all right. So you're not going to like the answer, big companies. But and we talk about this in the book. First of all, just to be clear, when we talk about fast, we're not talking about incremental improvement of efficiency and productivity. That's important, and that gets you to be faster. And actually, we sort of point out in the book, if you do digital and clear and fluid, you'll probably get a bit faster. Like that helps with your speed when you embrace digital technology. It helps with your speed when you make things visible. People make decisions quicker, et cetera, et cetera. Fluid, nimble hierarchies. You don't get stuck in bureaucracy. So you're a little bit faster, but we're actually talking about like leap ahead speed, like speed that people look around and go, "What? How did they do that? Like that doesn't make any sense." Right, like when, and we hate to mention Zappos too much, but like they went from 1 million. This is old news, but they went from $1 million in sales to $1 billion in sales in 8 years. Like selling shoes online, like that's amazing. Like how do they get that speed? And this leap ahead speed, the only way that you get it is if you give up control. Right? Like there's a quote in the book from Mario Andretti, the race car driver. He's like, if everything seems to be under control, you're just not going fast enough. Like this kind of speed requires us to give up control, and most of management for decades has been about establishing and maintaining control. Right? That's how we get the quality, that's how we get the efficiency and productivity, and that's true, but you trade that in for this kind of speed. And the companies that we looked at have found ways to give up that control and get this amazing speed. And the linchpin in doing that, because I'll also give you another tip, no one's going to give up control just because I told them to in a book. Like that, no, leaders do not give up control unless they have something that they can replace it with, and that something is trust. Like, what can I put my trust in that will enable me to give up the control and unleash that speed potential? Right? Like we gave an example. I'll tell this story. We opened the chapter with it from a company called Back to the Roots. Now, this is a small startup, so it's not the large company example, but it just illustrates the point. They make a couple of consumer products. They sell them through distribution partners, and they got a meeting with their number one buyer for this national chain of distribution outlets for them. And the guy's like, hey, I want to have a meeting with you in 3 days, and I want you to tell me what your new product ideas are that you have in the pipeline. And they're like, no problem. Unfortunately, they had no new ideas in the pipeline. Like they literally had not thought about it at all. They were so focused on doing their immediate their current products. And I'm telling you, any other organization I come across, they would have asked for a delay. They would have said, let me do this meeting in 2 weeks. Give me more time. But they said, no problem. They'll do it in 3 days. The CEO turned the project over to his staff and said, use the internet, use the 3D modeling software that we've been playing with, use your networks. Just give me some viable ideas for products that we could share with this guy in 3 days. And they did it, and they pulled the presentation together. And when they were done with the presentation, the guy was like, wow, so impressed. He said, this is amazing. These are great ideas. He literally said, why didn't you share these with me before? And I don't even know if they had the courage to say, because these ideas didn't exist 3 days ago. Okay? Now, in his case, and it's more limited, he was just trusting in his staff's ability to use the internet, ability to tap into their networks, ability to use the software. These are all talented people. Like, I'm going to trust in that, and I'm going to let them do their magic. And he got that kind of speed. In a bigger organization, there was more work involved in figuring out what you're going to trust, but you got to come up with something. So in our case study organization, which is a bank, it's not a huge bank. It's in Texas. They have multiple $1 billion of assets and branches across the state, so they're not tiny. They actually put their trust in their people's ability to build and maintain strong relationships, both internally and externally. That enables them to move faster. They can actually give loan application decisions like twice as fast as their competitors rather, because everybody not only knows each other so well internally so that they get their questions answered quicker, but they know their customers so well. They know their communities so well. They don't have, for instance, a call center, because that would separate you from your customers. If a customer calls in, you get someone in the branch who probably helped you yesterday and will help you next week and gets to know you so well that when you finally do apply for a loan, like they'll say, hey, I know your business does X, Y, and Z. You might want to include this in the application, or you might want to include this data over here. So they don't say yes to everybody, and they certainly don't make bad loans. Their numbers on that are awesome. That's what destroys banks. But they can make the decision quicker because they are willing to give up some of the control that most organizations have because they're relying and they're trusting those relationships. And so by the time we got to fluid and fast when we were writing this book, we started to realize that you can't. This is also maybe a warning shot for people out there. You can't do these things unless you have a really, really clear understanding of your organization's culture, and what drives your success. Like a lot of companies, this goes back to the big company thing. A lot of companies make some good strategic decisions and then build scale, and they succeed based on that. But they're not actually really clear about what makes them so successful and what's going to continue to make them so successful. You need that clarity if you're going to have like a fluid hierarchy, right? You need that clarity if you're going to figure out what it is that I can trust in order to give up control. Without that clarity, it feels too scary, and so people don't give up the trust, and they do it the traditional way. And so this is sort of, as we got to the end of the book, in addition to just saying, hey, these are capacities you need to know, we're like, and if you're not already working hard on your culture, if you're not already creating a culture that is compatible with this millennial era, then that's going to make it harder to even implement the ideas that we're writing about in the book.
Unmute. We are going to ask a couple of questions. If there are any more questions in the audience, please do use the Q&A panel. We would love to hear from you. There's one here which I think is good, as we start to wrap up the call. So Hillary from the Community Roundtable asked, some forward-thinking leaders seem to have a millennial mindset. Do you think millennials are limited to a specific age group, or can millennial thinking be seen in a shift in the broader culture?
Yeah, I sort of have an opinion about this. I think Maddie's laughing. I think so. The millennial mindset is just like a Generation X mindset or a baby boomer mindset. Any individual from any generation can have it. Like that's like, I mean, the whole point about generations, when you look at individuals, is you're either like your generation or you're not. So the millennial mindset that we talk about is the approach and the things that millennials value because they grew up in a particular time period in history, and that shapes what they value. So other people didn't grow up during that time period, but there's nothing stopping them from agreeing with the ideas. And to be honest, every organization, well, with the exception of Back to the Roots, the story I just told about the startup, every company that we profile in the book was founded and led by boomers and Xers. Okay, they created these organizations with an inherently millennial mindset, and they are not millennials. And to be honest, they didn't really do it in order to attract the millennials. Like, they didn't try to be like the millennials. They just created amazing organizations that happen to be consistent with this day and age. And that's sort of, to me, the millennial mindset is not necessarily better or worse. It is just better suited to what is happening today. It's better suited to our environment. And so I think it's going to be the face of leadership in the next several decades. But it's absolutely not just going to be millennials that are doing it. This is going to cut across all generations.
Is being having a millennial mindset kind of related to or similar to being digital native? Do you think? Are they those two go hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think the digital natives, those influences, like having those resources and that ability to get things done, this is what shaped the millennial mindset. But again, there are plenty of leaders. I mean, we learned this in Humanize, and we relearned it in writing When Millennials Take Over. Some of these ideas we're talking about, these are not new ideas. Like the ideas of sharing information, the ideas of having a more human-focused workforce and a human-focused culture, that was written about in the 1960s. Like, this is not new stuff necessarily, and so I think you're going to find it across all generations. It's just going to succeed today, and it didn't in the 60s. These challenges to traditional management failed because it was just ill-timed. But because of the millennial generation and the influences behind it, these changes, I think, are going to stick now, and that's why we need to do it now.
Maddie, do you have anything to add?
I've been listening to the conversation, and I don't know. I think I sort of have a problem with the whole millennial mindset idea, but not because I don't think it exists, but because I think it's the kind of terminology that might put off Xers and Boomers, who might think, well, why should we have a millennial mindset? You know what I mean? Like there's something sort of us and them about that. And our book is very, very, very much about, we're all in this together, like how to better work together. And while we don't go into it in great detail in the book, the conversations we have around the book very often start to delve into, the role of Gen X, for example, in bridging the gap between boomers and millennials. In sharing the historical knowledge and why we do things the way we do things now, and how to incorporate the digital nativeness and all these other millennial things into the way we should start working in the future without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That kind of conversation to me, which brings people together and kind of changes the conversation away from the negative, like kids these days versus the us versus them kind of thing. I think, and of course this is my personal opinion, but I think that's much more positive and optimistic and ultimately valuable way to talk about it. So anyway, rant over.
Guys, thank you for joining this call. We're coming up to a quarter of the hour, so maybe we will wrap it up here. For those who are watching online, if you have been saving up any questions, please bring them into the ESN chat, which is going to happen at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock Eastern. We'll be talking about the millennial generation. We'll be talking about Jamie and Maddie's book. We're talking about all things enterprise social network with the guys at the Community Roundtable. And I believe we're going to be giving away a couple of copies of the book, hardcover copies, the real thing, going to be mailed to you.
Signed hard copies, even.
Signed hard copies,
Yep.
Which is awesome. So we'll be giving those away during the ESN chat. That's at 2 o'clock using the hashtag ESN chat on Twitter. Jamie Notter, Maddie Grant, thank you very much for coming on and talking to us today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We always love to talk to you at Sitrion. And let's close the call now, and we will talk to you all again soon. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.